The Labyrinth and the Soul, Myths of the Afterlife in Ancient Greece. Intro: The Gate to Silence. The air is still. An owl calls in the night. Beneath your feet, the earth feels old. This is not just a moment, but a threshold. You are drifting, not quite awake, not yet asleep. Something ancient is near. They called it Hades. Not a hell, but a realm of shadows. For the Greeks, death was not a punishment, but a journey, a crossing into silence and memory. The soul did not vanish, it traveled. Guided by Hermes, it descended to the underworld. If rites were followed, a coin beneath the tongue, a proper farewell, Charon would carry it across the river Acheron. This is not a horror story, this is a story of myth and meaning. Death was part of life. One more step on the path. Some souls wandered through asphodel, others were judged. A few reached the Elysian fields, some were reborn. Tonight, we walk that path. We follow Orpheus into the dark, trace Persephone's return, and stand beside Demeter. We approach the mysteries, not to explain, but to feel. The labyrinth is not stone. It is memory, choice, and echo. Where do we go after death? What remains of us? Who remembers? These are not puzzles, they are doors. Tonight we open them. This is Bedtime Lectures. If you find meaning in these journeys, consider subscribing and leaving a suggestion for where we should wander next. Chapter 1: The Realm of Hades. In the hush that follows a final breath, the Greeks imagined a crossing, not into fire or glory, but into shadow. A descent, not into punishment, but into stillness, into memory. They called it Hades, not a place of demons or torment, but a kingdom beneath the world, vast and silent. The underworld, the unseen. In Greek, Hades simply meant the invisible. And fittingly so, its king, too, did not seek temples or songs. He ruled without pageantry, without the need to be seen. He was not a devil, he was a boundary. To step into Hades was not to suffer, but to pass through. It was not feared in the way modern minds fear death. It was accepted, respected, even expected. A necessary chapter in the soul's journey. The geography of the underworld began at the river Acheron, the river of pain. Souls arrived at its banks like fallen leaves on water, gray and soft and weightless. There they would meet Charon, the ferryman. Old and silent, cloaked and weathered, Charon rowed his barge across the black currents. But he did not carry all. Only those who had been buried properly, who had a coin beneath their tongue, an obol, payment for passage. Those without were left to wander the shore for 100 years, unwept, unhonored, unfound. This rite was more than superstition. It was a contract, a recognition of the soul's need to continue. The coin was not just metal, it was memory, grief, and care. To forget this duty was to deny the soul its journey. Once across, the soul entered the realm of Hades, not a pit, but a place, a land with roads and walls, with fields and rivers, yet all in a hush. Not silent from absence, but quiet with weight. The kind of quiet that gathers in cathedrals or ancient forests. It was not lifeless. It was full of memory. There were 5 rivers that shaped the world below. Acheron, the river of pain. Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Phlegethon, the river of fire, not destructive, but burning with passion and oath. Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, whose waters washed memory clean. And Styx, the river of oaths, black and binding, across which even the gods swore and never lied. In the heart of it all stood the palace of Hades and Persephone, a palace not of gold, but of dark stone, quiet halls, and flickering lamps. Here the king and queen ruled, not cruelly, but justly. Their presence was constant but distant. Hades was no tyrant. He was a custodian of order. And Persephone, she who returns, was both queen and echo of spring. Their throne was not adorned with jewels, but with shadows of stories. Here the great were humbled, and the humble remembered. This was the final democracy. The underworld had its judges, 3 sons of Zeus, once kings among men: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus. They weighed lives not by power, but by virtue, not by belief, but by deeds. The judgment was quiet. It was not spectacle, but reflection. Most souls were sent to the fields of asphodel, a pale, neutral plain where they wandered in a kind of dream. Not punished, not rewarded. They simply were. Their memories faded like mist, their desires stilled. It was peace, but not joy. Others fewer were sent to Tartarus, a deep abyss where the truly wicked were bound. Sisyphus with his stone, Tantalus forever thirsty, Ixion spinning on his wheel. But even these punishments were not endless flame. They were metaphors, not torture, but truths about desire, arrogance, betrayal. And beyond all that, further still, lay the Elysian fields, a paradise of soft breeze, golden light, and endless song, reserved for heroes, poets, and those loved by the gods, a place not of rest, but of fullness. The soul did not sleep there. It sang. To the Greeks, this was the map of what comes next, but it was more than a map. It was a mirror. The underworld reflected the world above, and just as a mirror does not lie, neither did the myths. They told not of a place, but of a truth, that life continues in what we leave behind. Even in death, there was form, there was order, there was story, and that perhaps was the greatest comfort of all. Chapter 2. The Soul's Journey. The moment of death was not abrupt in the Greek imagination. It was not a door slammed shut, but a breath released, a final exhale that lingered like mist. The soul, they believed, did not leap or vanish. It drifted. It slipped from the body as smoke slips from a candle, softly, silently, and then began its journey. The Greeks called the soul psyche, a word that meant breath, life, essence. It was what made a person more than flesh. And when the body failed, the psyche took its first step into the afterlife. The guide was Hermes, not in his winged, mischievous aspect, but as Hermes Psychopompos, the soul leader. In this role, he was solemn, kind, and dutiful. He did not judge. He did not command. He simply showed the way. Hermes led the soul downwards, not into hell, but into depth, the world beneath the world. The air grew thicker, the light more distant, and sounds fell away. It was not frightening, but unfamiliar. A landscape without time, where space did not stretch, but folded. Here the soul was not pulled, but drawn inward. The first river it encountered was Acheron, the river of pain. Not torment, but grief. The grief of parting, of things undone. The soul stood at its edge, met by the silent boatman Charon. If the soul carried its coin, it was allowed across. If not, it lingered in a gray dusk, waiting, sometimes for centuries, until memory itself became its payment. Once ferried across Acheron, the journey deepened. The soul passed through the mists of Cocytus, the river of lamentation. Here it heard cries not of punishment, but of release. Regrets, whispered farewells, things left unsaid. These were not accusations, but echoes. The soul did not suffer, it remembered. Next came Phlegethon, the river of fire. Not a burning torment, but a cleansing heat. The fire of passion, of oath, of consequence. Every flame here was a promise once made. Some glowed gently, others flickered wildly. The soul passed by, not burned, but illuminated, seeing what its life had kindled. The most dangerous river was Lethe, the river of forgetting. Its waters shimmered with peace. One sip, and the soul would forget pain, joy, name, and purpose. Some longed for it, others feared it. Those who wished rebirth would one day drink, but not yet. Memory had to be faced before it could be released. Styx was last, the river of sacred oaths, where gods themselves swore binding promises. Its waters were dark, still, and absolute. Nothing crossed Styx unchanged, not even memory. Having crossed these rivers, the soul entered the heart of the underworld. This was not a destination, but a mirror, a place where the soul saw itself clearly. There were no walls, only boundaries shaped by memory. The geography of the dead was internal. Some souls wandered, repeating familiar paths, the places they had loved, the fears they had avoided, the names they could not release. Others found peace in stillness, accepting what was. A few searched for someone, for something, for meaning. In the fields of Asphodel, the ordinary souls drifted, not punished but quiet. Their days echoed the lives they had lived, routine, gentle, and dim. Beyond them lay deeper zones, shaped not by gods, but by inner truth. Some souls found themselves walking labyrinths, not of stone, but of thought. They remembered choices, replayed moments, listened to their own silence. This was not judgment, but understanding. And then there were those who did not stop. Souls who had loved deeply, lost terribly, or lived vividly. They moved with purpose, not to escape, but to find. The soul's journey was not one of distance, but of depth. Every step inward was a layer peeled back. Ego dissolved, regret surfaced, love endured. And through it all, the soul shed weight, not punished, but purified. In this way, the underworld was not simply a realm of the dead. It was a realm of meaning. The Greek myths did not speak of hells and heavens, but of memory and echo, of walking through one's own story until the noise faded and only essence remained. At the end, the soul reached a threshold. Some stepped into the Elysian fields, where the wind sang and time stood still. Others turned toward Lethe, ready to forget and begin again. And some, rare and few, vanished into the mysteries. Places even myth could not name. Not endings, but dissolutions, where self and world became one, and silence was not absence, but home. Thus was the journey. Not a punishment, but a passage. Not to a destination, but to the center of the self. The Greeks believed we each carried our underworld within us, shaped by memory, softened by time, and lit by the quiet flame of soul. And in walking its path, we came to understand what it meant to live. Chapter 3. Judges of the Dead. When the soul crossed the final river and stepped into the quiet realm of Hades, it did not disappear. It did not dissolve into mist or scatter into silence. It stood, and it waited. Here at the threshold of memory, the Greeks imagined three figures, not gods, but once men. Three judges, seated not on thrones of gold, but on the still ground of eternity. Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, brothers in myth, sons of Zeus, rulers once and rulers still, but now of something deeper than kingdoms. They judged not the living, but the lived. They were not executioners, not punishers. They were custodians of balance, keepers of the soul's weight. They listened, not to words, but to echoes, to choices, gestures, the music of a life. Minos, the eldest, sat in the center. He was finality, the voice that spoke last. Rhadamanthus, just and stern, held the scales. Aeacus, solemn and precise, stood at the gate, deciding who would enter and where they would go. There was no fiery trial, no tormenting accusations, no divine courtroom with scrolls or scribes. The Greeks imagined judgment as clarity, as memory distilled. The soul remembered itself, and the judges listened. They did not count sins. They did not reward prayers. They measured balance between harm and help, between courage and cowardice, between truth and concealment. In this, the Greeks expressed something radical. That virtue was not obedience. That morality was not submission. The soul was not judged for whom it had worshipped, but for how it had lived. To lie was not evil, but to live falsely, to betray the self, to harm needlessly, that weighed heavily. To suffer did not earn reward. To choose goodness when one could have chosen otherwise, did. This judgment was private, not spectacle, not drama, no audience. Only the soul and the three who listened. And from this silence, a path was chosen. Most were sent to the asphodel meadows, a neutral plain, soft, gray, familiar. Souls here walked in forgetfulness, but not torment. They became shadow-like reflections of who they once were, not punished, but paused. Others, the rare ones, were lifted toward the Elysian fields, not for belief, but for balance, for lives lived in harmony. With others, with the self, with the world. These were not saints, they were whole, and a few were turned toward Tartarus, the deepest place. Not because they had broken laws, but because they had broken what was sacred in others. Cruelty, betrayal, pride without regret. These formed the gravity that pulled a soul downward. But Tartarus, too, was not fire. It was consequence. The punishment always matched the act, not in cruelty, but in form. Sisyphus, who defied the gods with cleverness and deceit, was condemned to endless futility. Tantalus, who violated trust, was left forever wanting. Ixion, who transgressed all bonds, spun endlessly alone. Through these judgments, the Greeks spoke not of vengeance, but of order, not divine wrath, but natural return. Justice to them was not about making wrongs suffer. It was about restoring balance. The world must breathe evenly, and each life either gave or took from that breath. In the myths, these judges did not offer warnings. They offered reflection. Their presence reminded the living not to fear death, but to live well. To live justly, not because of judgment, but because of harmony. Because inner order was its own reward. In the rituals of Eleusis, in the writings of the poets, and in the quiet customs of mourning, this belief echoed, that after death we do not face wrath, but recognition, not punishment, but presence. And so the Greeks lived not in fear, but in rhythm. They sought measure in their actions, kindness, moderation, courage, not because a god demanded it, but because the soul one day would remember and be heard. The judges of the dead were not strangers. They were us, or who we might become. If given eternity, would we be just? Would we weigh without hatred? Would we listen? In the end, the judgment was not a threat. It was a mirror. And all the underworld asked of the soul was that it tell the truth. Chapter 4. The Fields of Asphodel. Beyond the judgment, past the rivers and the whispers of memory, lay a place that was neither dark nor bright, a plain stretching wide and pale under a sky that never changed. The Fields of Asphodel. To the ancient Greeks, this was where most souls arrived, not heroes, not villains, not the remembered or reviled, but the ordinary, the countless. The asphodel was a flower, pale, ghostly, persistent. It grew in poor soil, in places hard to love. It did not boast. it endured. And so too did the souls who wandered among it, quiet, endless, still. Here there was no punishment, but neither was there joy. The souls walked without aim, not in pain, but in absence. They murmured echoes of the lives they once lived, names forgotten, gestures repeated like habits that had outlived their purpose. No one wept here, no one laughed. Time did not pass, and yet eternity unfolded. There was no hunger, but also no fulfillment. No longing because desire had faded. It was not torment. It was something stranger, neutrality. In the Greek view, this was not a cruel fate. It was simply the natural destination for those whose lives had neither shined with greatness nor sunk into cruelty, who had lived, worked, spoken, and passed without extremes. To be average in this cosmology was not shameful, but it was not free. It carried a consequence, not a punishment, but a weight, the weight of the unlived, the unremembered, the unchosen. The souls in the asphodel meadows did not suffer, but they had no story. They did not cry, but neither could they dream. This, perhaps, was the quiet warning in the myth, not that the mediocre are punished, but that they are stilled, that to avoid risk, to fear choice, to drift through life without reflection, is to arrive at a place where reflection is all that remains and where nothing stirs. The Greeks did not revere ambition for its own sake, but they respected clarity, intention, to act with meaning, to love even if it led to loss, to fight even if defeat came, to speak even if no one listened. For those who never reached beyond their daily rhythm, the fields of asphodel became a mirror, a repetition not of punishment, but of pattern. They walked as they had lived, without turning. The meadows stretched endlessly, and the souls wandered, not trapped, not held, but paused. Their thoughts like dust, their memories thin. And yet, the Greeks believed this too was sacred. Even this silent crowd, even these unnamed ghosts were part of the balance. They were not judged unworthy. They were simply remembered as they had been. Sometimes it was said a soul might stir, a name might return, a memory might spark, a face, a voice, a moment of love. And in that moment the soul might turn its gaze toward Elysium or toward rebirth. But most remained, like mist, like sleep, a gentle dream without waking. The fields of asphodel were not a warning, they were a truth, that most lives are quiet, that not every soul becomes a story. And yet in telling these myths, the Greeks honored even the silence, even the drifting, even the lives that left no trace but a whisper. For in the end, the asphodel blooms not with brilliance, but with persistence. And perhaps that too is a kind of eternity. Chapter 5. The Elysian Fields. Far beyond the meadows of asphodel, past the quiet murmurs of the many, lay a place reserved for the few. Not higher, not deeper, simply elsewhere. The Elysian Fields. To the ancient Greeks, this was not heaven. It was not reward in the sense of divine approval. It was something gentler, rarer, a state of fulfillment, a realm of completion. The Elysian Fields, or Elysium, were imagined as an eternal spring. The air was always warm, the sky always clear, the breeze always soft. But more than this, it was a place without fear, without regret, a place where the soul could be fully itself, and nothing more was needed. Who came here? Not the pious for their prayers, not the meek for their humility, but those whose lives had moved with excellence, heroes, poets, philosophers, the brave, the wise, the kind. But not merely those who followed rules, those who embodied something, It was said that Achilles came here, and Patroclus, and those who had fought not for conquest, but for honor. Orpheus, whose music softened even the stones, was said to have wandered Elysium, his lyre still in hand. Hesiod, Pindar, those whose voices carried truth. Elysium was not for those who avoided wrong, but for those who embraced right with fullness. It was not about purity, but about resonance. A life lived deeply, sincerely, fearlessly. In the Eleusinian mysteries, initiates were promised a glimpse of this place, not through vision, but through transformation. The feeling that life and death were not opposites, but complements. That joy was not escape from pain, but its embrace. Elysium, then, was less a location than a culmination. Not a reward granted, but a reality entered by those who had lived in tune with what was sacred. Not by being perfect, but by being whole. There was no toil in Elysium, no aging, no striving, but neither was there numbness. Souls here remembered, not with sorrow, but with clarity. They sang, they danced, they thought. Time was not counted because it was no longer needed. And yet, even in Elysium, there was choice. Some souls, after long joy, chose to be reborn, to return to the world not out of restlessness, but of love, to live again, to strive again, to feel again, even pain. They walked to the river Lethe, drank and forgot, and were born anew. Others remained. It was said that Elysium could become the Isles of the Blessed, a further place, a final one, where souls who had passed through Elysium 3 times, each time choosing goodness, would rest forever. Beyond rebirth, beyond desire. Complete. To the Greeks, this was not fantasy, but reflection. Elysium showed what it meant to be fulfilled. It was not about eternal pleasure. It was about harmony, between soul and self, between life and meaning. Modern minds might ask, did the Greeks believe this place was real? And the answer is layered. Elysium was real in the way that music is real, in the way that hope is real. It lived not on maps, but in memory, in imagination, in the way people carried themselves when they believed life had purpose. Because to live with purpose was to move toward Elysium, to act with courage, to create beauty, to seek wisdom. It was not a place you earned. It was a place you became worthy of. And so the myths told not just of where the soul went, but what the soul could become. The Elysian fields were not merely fields. They were the flowering of a life well lived. And for the Greeks, that was the truest immortality of all. Chapter 6. Tartarus and the Punished. Beneath even the stillness of Hades, deeper than the meadows of Asphodel and the joy of Elysium, lay a darker realm. A pit without floor, a chasm without horizon. Tartarus. To the Greeks, Tartarus was not simply a place of suffering. It was a space of weight, where the heaviest of deeds settled. Not in fire or chaos, but in echoing repetition. It was a realm for the punished, yes, but not in the way later ages would imagine. This was not hell. It was consequence. Tartarus was the domain where those who had committed acts beyond measure found themselves not tortured, but mirrored, trapped not by pain, but by the shape of their own actions. Here was Sisyphus, straining endlessly to push his stone up the hill, only to watch it roll back, again and again. Not because the gods hated him, but because he had tried to outwit death itself, to cheat fate. His cleverness had become a cycle, his pride a task with no end. Here was Tantalus, chin deep in water he could not drink, surrounded by fruit he could never touch. Not because he was evil, but because he had betrayed trust, offering his own son in a feast for the gods. His punishment was not thirst, but desire eternally unfulfilled. Ixion spun on his fiery wheel, not for war, but for betrayal of the sacred guest-host bond, and for reaching where no mortal should. His endless motion was not agony, but exile from stillness, a punishment not of fire, but of being unable to stop. Each of these souls was not simply tormented. They were trapped in meaning. Their fates were not cruel inventions, but reflections of the life they had lived. For the Greeks, punishment was never about vengeance. It was about resonance. What you became in life, you faced in death, not because a god decreed it, but because truth echoed. The soul did not suffer for sin. It endured the shape of its choices. This is why Tartarus was feared, not for pain, but for futility. For the Greeks, the deepest horror was not burning, but repetition, not agony, but absurdity. A life stripped of renewal, reduced to endless echo. Tartarus also held beings older than humanity, titans imprisoned after the wars with the Olympians, creatures of chaos locked away so the world could have order. In this, Tartarus was not just a prison, but a seal, a necessary boundary. Yet even here, in the deepest dark, there was structure, law, form. The punishments matched the deeds. They were not arbitrary, they were stories. And through these stories, the Greeks explored their own fears of excess, of betrayal, of arrogance. Tartarus warned not against sin, but against forgetting limits, against becoming so full of self that you could no longer see the other, against seeking power without wisdom. And so the tales of the punished were told, not to terrify, but to teach, to remind listeners that actions echo, that the soul carries the weight of its choices. That meaning, once lost, may be difficult to find again. For the Greeks, Tartarus was the opposite of Elysium, not in location, but in direction. One led to harmony, the other to endless dissonance. But even Tartarus was not a final judgment. There was no eternal damnation in the Greek cosmos. The soul might remain, but it might also learn, might change, might in time return. Because even in darkness there was the potential for reflection. And in reflection, a chance, however distant, for release. Thus, the myths do not tell us to fear Tartarus as an end. They ask us to see it as a mirror we build ourselves, and to remember, while living, to walk with care. Not in fear of punishment, but in hope of meaning. Chapter 7. Orpheus and Eurydice. Among the many souls who wandered the underworld, one came not in death, but in song. One came not to stay, but to ask. Orpheus. His name was whispered even among the shades, for he had done what no mortal had dared, descended into Hades, not because he must, but because he could not live with loss. Eurydice, his love, had died too young, a snake's bite, a sudden absence. And Orpheus, the poet, the singer, could not accept a world that no longer held her voice. So he did the unthinkable. He crossed the boundary. With only his lyre, he entered the realm of the dead, and the underworld listened. They say the rivers stilled when he played, that Cerberus, the hound who knew only duty, laid down his heads in sleep, that the judges, who never swayed, paused in silence. Even Hades and Persephone felt the music, not with their ears, but with their memory. For Orpheus did not plead, he sang. He sang of days in the sun, of soft laughter, of the way she looked back at him over her shoulder. He did not ask for pity, he offered truth. And for a moment, truth moved the dead. The rulers of the underworld granted his request. Eurydice could return, but with one condition. He must not look back until they had both reached the upper world. It seemed simple, but the journey upward is the most uncertain. The path back to life winds through shadows and silence is loud. Behind him, Orpheus heard no footsteps, felt no breath, just the weight of trust. He walked, and he doubted. Was she there? Had the gods tricked him? Was this a dream? Step by step, the edge of the world drew near. And at the final moment, just before light broke over stone, he turned. And she vanished, not with a cry, not with anger, but like a candle snuffed by breath. A look passed between them, sorrow, understanding, and love. And then she was gone. Orpheus returned alone. He had descended into death, changed its rhythm, and still he failed. Not because he disobeyed, but because he could not live without knowing. What does it mean to look back? The Greeks saw in this myth not just a tragedy, but a mirror. The soul, once touched by loss, is drawn to the past. Memory becomes weight, love becomes echo. And to look back is not weakness, it is longing. But longing in the underworld has a price. Orpheus's story is not about punishment, it is about being human. He brought music to silence, beauty to shadow. He reminded even the gods of feeling. But he also reminded mortals of the thin line between memory and surrender. Some say he wandered the earth after that, singing to the stones. Some say he shunned all love. Others say he died by violence, torn apart by those who could not bear the purity of his grief. But always, he remained the one who dared to follow love into death. And in doing so, taught that love does not conquer death, but it can speak to it. Even if only for a while, Orpheus failed. But in that failure, he became eternal. Not because he won, but because he tried, and because his song still lingers. Like memory, like hope, like the faint sound of footsteps that might or might not be following behind us. Chapter 8. Persephone and the Seasons of the Soul. Before she was queen, she was a daughter. Before she ruled the underworld, she danced in the fields. Persephone. The myth begins not in darkness, but in bloom. A girl picking flowers, a spring afternoon. And then, the earth opened. Hades rose in his chariot and took her. Some say she screamed, others say she was silent. The stories differ, as memory does. But what followed changed not only her life, but the world's rhythm. Demeter, her mother, searched, goddess of grain, of harvest, of life itself. She scoured the earth in grief. Fields withered, rivers dried. The world mourned with her, not because she commanded it, but because she carried its beating heart. When she found that her daughter had been taken, she withdrew. She withheld the harvest. She refused to let things grow. And so the first winter came. The myth of Persephone is not just a tale of abduction. It is a myth of transformation, of descent and return, of the soul that must pass through shadow to understand the light. In the underworld, Persephone did not remain a prisoner. She became a queen, not a consort, but a force. She sat beside Hades, not in chains, but in silence. A presence that commanded without needing to speak. She ate the seeds of the pomegranate. Some say in innocence, some say in defiance, but once consumed, they tied her to the realm below. And so, a compromise was made. Each year, she would return to the world above, and each year, she would descend again. Spring and winter, growth and stillness, life and death, not as opposites, but as seasons. To the Greeks, Persephone's story explained the turning of the earth, but more than that, it gave shape to sorrow. It showed that grief could be cyclical, that loss was not forever, that return was possible. And in this cycle, there was wisdom. Each of us, in some way, is Persephone. There are times we walk in light, with clarity, with ease, and times when we fall into confusion, into memory, into silence. But the fall is not failure. It is part of the turning. The underworld, for her, was not just a place of the dead, it was a place of depth, a space of becoming. When she returned to the surface, she did not come back the same. She brought with her something the world needed, the balance of understanding. Demeter's joy at their reunion was the joy of spring, wild, green, overflowing, but it was never permanent. It was never meant to be, and that too was sacred. For the Greeks, the seasons were not weather. They were reflections of what the soul endures, of what the body remembers. Winter was not punishment, it was pause. Spring was not reward, it was renewal. And between them, Persephone, queen of both worlds, guardian of passage, the one who walks willingly between life and shadow. In the Eleusinian mysteries, her journey was reenacted each year, not as spectacle, but as transformation. Initiates were led into darkness, then into light, to feel, not just to hear, that death was not the end. Persephone reminded them that descent is not defeat, that stillness is not silence, that within the earth seeds sleep. And when the time comes, they rise. So do we. Thus her myth is not only about a goddess, it is about the soul, about how we endure change, how we accept return, how we carry shadow not as burden, but as balance. In every grief is a season, in every ending a seed, and in every soul the memory of light, waiting. Chapter 9. The Mysteries of Eleusis. Some truths are not spoken. They are enacted, felt, passed from hand to hand, from silence to silence. So it was with the mysteries of Eleusis. For nearly 2,000 years, in a small sanctuary west of Athens, the Greeks gathered to honor Demeter and Persephone, to remember the descent and the return, to step for a brief time into the rhythm of death and rebirth. The rites were secret. That was the first law. Initiates were forbidden to describe what they saw, and so we do not know the details, only the shape, the feeling left behind. And yet those who emerged from the darkness carried with them something unshakable, the belief that death was not the end. The mysteries were not for priests or scholars. They were for anyone, citizen or slave, man or woman, who spoke Greek and came with reverence. They did not require purity, only sincerity. The journey began in Athens, where initiates walked in procession to Eleusis, following the sacred way. Along the road were stops and symbols, jokes and songs, tears and rites, laughter mingled with fear. It was a preparation, not of knowledge, but of soul. Once inside the sanctuary, they entered darkness. There, something was shown, something was said, something was enacted. The details were never written, but ancient writers agreed what was seen in Eleusis changed the heart, not with spectacle, but with presence. Some said a single stalk of grain was revealed, glowing in the dark. Others spoke of sacred drama, of Persephone's return, of Demeter's joy, of the soul's journey through shadow. But what mattered was not the scene. It was the experience. To feel death not as terror, but as passage. To know in the marrow that life continues. The mysteries taught that the soul is not erased, that loss is not empty, that the world is not cruel, but cyclical. In this way, the rites of Eleusis were not teachings. They were transformations. To emerge from the sanctuary was to return changed, softer, braver, not because all questions had answers, but because fear no longer held the same shape. Plato hinted at the mysteries in his writings. Pindar praised them in verse. Cicero, a Roman, said that to have participated was the greatest gift of civilization, for it taught not just how to die, but how to live. Even centuries later, when the rites were suppressed and the sanctuary burned, their echo lingered. In philosophy, in ritual, in poetry. The mysteries did not offer dogma, they offered presence, and through that presence, peace. To walk through darkness, to see something sacred, to emerge into light. That was enough. The soul, once touched by Eleusis, was said to carry a kind of clarity, a gentleness toward grief, a patience with the unknown, not the certainty of salvation, but the dignity of belonging. For in Eleusis, the Greeks met not gods on thrones, but symbols in motion. Life and death danced, mother and daughter embraced. And the watchers, the initiates, felt themselves not separate, but included. They were not told what to believe. They were shown what it felt like to return. And that, for many, was enough to calm the fear that waits behind every heartbeat. Thus, the mysteries remind us, not all wisdom is loud. Not all truths are spoken. Some must be walked, felt, remembered in silence, like the seed that sleeps beneath the earth, unseen, until it rises again. Chapter 10. The Labyrinth Within. Greek myths about death were never just about endings. They were about paths, choices, turns, and understanding. At the center of these stories lies the symbol of the labyrinth, not a trap, but a journey, not confusion, but process. The labyrinth reflects the soul's path. Each turn is a decision, each wall a challenge, each silence a space for meaning. The Greeks didn't imagine the afterlife as reward or punishment. It was a mirror, where the soul sees what it is and what it carries. In the story of the Minotaur, the labyrinth was a place of danger. Yet the true test was not the beast, but the choice to enter. The courage to face what waits at the center, to understand, to return changed. So too is the journey of life. To live was to move through uncertainty, through grief, memory, desire, not in search of perfection, but meaning. The soul was not judged by belief, but by presence, by action, by how deeply it had felt, chosen, endured. Myths of Hades and Persephone, of Orpheus and the judges, were not threats. They were maps. The Greeks saw death not as a wall, but a door, not the end, but part of a cycle. The underworld was not empty. It was full of memory. And the soul remained active, not frozen, but searching. This is what the labyrinth shows us, not what is final, but what continues. Each step matters, each memory shapes, each loss leaves a path. The Greeks did not fear death. They prepared for it by living, not loudly, but clearly, not endlessly, but well. The labyrinth is not a punishment, it's a truth, and at its center, the soul is not lost, only waiting to be known. Thank you for joining this journey. You've been listening to Bedtime Lectures. If this path brought you insight, consider subscribing and leaving a suggestion for the next myth we might explore. Until then, rest well and walk gently.